See these headphones? I have to wear them now because I'm a professional and that's what podcasters do, you know? Oh, please, Logic, don't screw this up. Please, please, please. Guys, I hate to spoil my own review, but this is the album that has Bohemian Rhapsody on it, and that's one of my favorite songs ever. You know this is going to be good. I am so excited! Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Christened Music Podcast, where if it's listenable, it's Christenable. I'm your host, Chris Martins. Today, we are finally going to take a look at Queen's A Night at the Opera. Now, I've been waiting a long time to get back into this one, give or take 2 or 3 years. It's one of those 21 albums that I have been meaning to revisit at some point, and what an album it is. This record is about as good as I remember it. Sure, there's a few minor production problems from what I've heard here and there, but despite that, this album was well worth the wait. Nearly everything on this record sounds great. The production is super creative, and it's so exciting that it's like fireworks going off in your ears. The composition has that classic rock feel with very catchy riffs, but there are also tracks that go off the deep end into something a little more epic. It's an album split between fun and heavy, and it executes both very well. Even with this album's flaws, it really, really makes me happy. A Night at the Opera is a pretty clean and clear record from a sound quality standpoint. The instruments are handled quite gracefully. The guitars are nice and clear, for example, such as the acoustic guitars on 39 that are really, really full sounding. Electric guitars do a nice job of filling out sound when they're in the background. The bass is audible, although I really wish it were more prominent. Lead guitars are always prominent, even if it's at the expense of balance, which I'll get to in a second. Don't you worry. The drums are a bit interesting to me. When they're given an equal role in the mix, their clarity and punchiness shines through, but I feel like this album does not give drums enough room to shine. Sometimes drums are really quiet when they really should be given an equal role. The whole band just kind of ducks for guitar solos. While I do like the melody is on top, I feel that the guitar should be making its own space. The melody should be making its own space. It's the backing band's job to back that melody up. And to me, the production should not artificially nerf that backing band. And weirdly enough, there are moments where harmonies fill out the sound, such as 39, but also there are moments such as Sweet Lady where Freddie's lone vocals are fighting to be heard over the band. I find myself losing the plot a bit as to what they were going for from a mixing standpoint. Like, what are you? More balanced and a more well-rounded, cohesive sound would be good for this album. And I feel a balanced sound would add a lot more grandeur. But on this album, mixing is kind of scatterbrained. The panning and effects, however, are among some of the most creative and flashy I've ever heard in music. This album immediately brings the heat in this regard, with those leads coming in to tickle your ears one at a time on Death on Two Legs, the opening track. And we're just getting started here. There's hard panning on the end of 39, a typical old school rock trope, which gives this album character, but there's also a guitar lead panning from left to right at the end of Sweet Lady. And this isn't even getting into the Prophet song and Bohemian Rhapsody, the two epics of this album. Part of why these two songs work is from vocal layering alone. Freddie Mercury is obviously an incredible vocalist, but the vocal layering on these two songs is what really makes him pop. The a cappella section of the Prophet song in particular is one of my favorite moments in the whole album. It just sounds so full, yet so creative. The Prophet song's chords paint such a vivid and colorful sonic picture, and it's all from this dude's voice. I wish this production were a little more cohesive from track to track, but man, does it have its moments. Composition is one of the big selling points for this album, even if the production doesn't handle it as well as I would have hoped. Pianos are beautiful right from the get-go, and then they transition into something a little more biting with those staccato chords. Bohemian Rhapsody is famous for this, among other things. The synths on You're My Best Friend and Good Company are great as well. When you can hear bass, you can hear really nice licks on You're My Best Friend in particular. It's like the bassist primarily wrote this song or something. It's not the flashiest instrument of the bunch, but listening for it is really rewarding. Drums are in a similar boat, but they're louder because someone needs to keep time. They keep time well, and they keep the vibe of each song. They're not technically complicated, but they're really groovy on those swung tracks, whether mid-tempo on You're My Best Friend and Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon, or fast swing on Seaside, Rendezvous, and Good Company. There are epic crash-filled patterns on the Prophet song and In Love With My Car, and more low-key patterns that are folksy on 39. And speaking of diversity, how can I talk about this record without mentioning guitars? Not only is this album mainly a guitar-led album, but the guitars leading it are great. The rhythm guitars add some girth to this record and are a quite solid foundation, a foundation for lead guitars to do their thing and shine. Lead guitars always have a lick or two to keep you hooked, especially in that first half. They are pretty noodly throughout each song, and the solos are even more noodly and ambitious. They always fit the mold of each song, and they burst through, and they add flash and power to this record. Speaking of the mold of each song, structure is pretty neat on this record. At first, I thought this record had no flow whatsoever, and the songs had no rhyme or reason as to why they were where they were. Then I realized that this album was released in 1975, and therefore would likely be primarily sold in vinyl, which has a side A and a side B. This first side is what I like to call the night section because it is populated with the fun songs that Queen would play in a concert setting. Oh god, I miss concerts so much, man! Oh! These songs are fun and accessible. I'm pretty sure I've heard You're My Best Friend in commercials a million times. They have hints of the Beatles and ragtime, but also Queen's signature swing style. That first half is a fun night out. Then, when that half is over, you get the second half, which is far deeper and far more experimental. This is the opera section, and it goes from the epic The Prophet's Song to the closer in Queen's cover of the British national anthem, God Save the Queen, which wraps up the record in a nice little bow, as that's what they would play when they took their bows and finished their sets. Each song transitions fairly effortlessly in this section, especially from The Prophet's Song to Love of My Life. Ooh, that coda into that harp. Nice. However, the meat of this section is in its long, operatic songs in The Prophet's Song and Bohemian Rhapsody. The Prophet's Song focuses on heaviness and being epic and large, while Bohemian Rhapsody is more of a heartfelt showstopper. I revere Bohemian Rhapsody so much, particularly because of its popularity and how it defined musical ambition in its time, but also how it transitions from one movement to the next. Hell, I named an award after it, the Bohemian Rhapsody Award for Best Song with Multiple Parts, that I bestow upon one song per decade. That song was the first representing the 70s, then came Metallica's Orion from the 80s, Radiohead's Paranoid Android from the 90s, then Green Day's Jesus of Suburbia for the 2000s, and Kendrick Lamar's Mad City for the 2010s. Good company, if I do say so myself. Needless to say, Queen's A Night at the Opera has a lot going for it compositionally, and its legend status is only further cemented by... The lyrics on this thing are anywhere from your standard classic rock fare to Beatles vibes to absolutely legendary. There is not a bad song on here from a lyrical standpoint, and the people who sing them are always on point. Before I get to you know who, let's talk about everyone else, shall we? Roger Taylor's voice on In Love with My Car is gravelly and passionate, but it also has a bit of clean niceness to it. It's like if the passionate gruffness of Pink Floyd's Roger Waters and the lightness of Pink Floyd's David Gilmour somehow meshed into one unit. Brian May's vocals on Good Company are very Beatles-esque and whimsical. This is helped by the harmonies behind him, which might surpass the Fab Four. Throughout this album, there are harmonies that often dominate the record whether you like it or not. They are mixed over the lead vocals too often than I'd like, but man, they are nice and full. The a cappella section in Prophet's song in particular, with the call and response from Freddie and the boys on the harmonies, is amazing. But nothing quite compares to the man himself, Freddie Mercury. He was one of the greatest frontmen since Cab Calloway, and of course, he's amazing on this record. He displays his tonal capability as he can go really clean on songs like Love of My Life, as well as we see him go really loud and passionate on You're My Best Friend when he hits that high C. His sense of timing is impeccable on that a cappella part I mentioned earlier, where he plays around with the delay effect. With all that said, I believe feeling behind your vocals is the most important thing you can have, and Freddie Mercury must have thought so too. His voice is expressive from the get-go, doing exactly what the song calls for at all times. He's spiteful on the opener, sad on Love of My Life, and whimsical on Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon. You feel every single note this man sings. He commands so much power from his voice alone. Man, part of me wishes that I could be alive to see this guy perform live, because wow, man. As for lyrical analysis, this was a bit of a puzzle to decipher. Like I said, I thought there was little cohesion from start to finish, as I was expecting an overarching theme throughout the whole of the album, because, well, opera does that. And this album is called A Night at the Opera. This doesn't do that entirely. However, this side A, side B thing really comes into play here, and they play with two different lyrical structures on this album. The first side has little to no connective tissue, but it's structured in the most diverse way possible. This is the night section, after all, and these are the most accessible pop tracks that everyone wants to hear. It darts from concrete to abstract, from song to song, and they are all jams. This is the concert set list that everyone parties to, but once the party's over, we get to side B. And those who stick around get to hear an opera about how Queen really feels about their current situation. It goes deeper and deeper into how Freddie and the rest of the band think. It starts large yet urgent on the Prophet's song, and we keep zooming in as the album goes along. Love of My Life is a heartfelt ballad about Freddie Mercury's relationship with Mary Austin and how much he misses her. Even Good Company, as whimsical as it is a really sad song about poring over your work so hard that you neglect your friends and family, and then you grow old and die. Alone. And it all culminates on Bohemian Rhapsody, a song about a man who commits a murder, then has to leave his family, then goes insane until finally resigning himself to whatever may come of him. Theoretically, this song was about Freddie Mercury coming out as bisexual and dealing with the consequences brought on by a homophobic society. Either way, it just hit me like a truck. Maybe it was what was sung, maybe it was how it was sung, or just its placement on the album as a show-stopping number at the end of the track listing, which makes the actual triumphant closer, God Save the Queen, that much sadder. But either way, I was just floored. This album does everything right from a lyrical standpoint, and I am just left without words. Yeah, I love this record. I loved it when I first listened to it, and I still love it now that I'm revisiting it and going over it with a fine-tooth comb. First, let's talk about the bad, or rather, the not excellent. The instruments are recorded nice and clearly, and the production is definitely high gloss. However, mixing kind of nursed that, because this album's mixing makes instruments quieter and louder all willy-nilly, and consequently, balance is a major issue. Drums fall in and out of the mix on some songs like the opener, the singer sometimes fighting to be heard, ironically over overpowering harmonies. I would prefer a more streamlined sound to make for a more cohesive identity for this record, at least from a production standpoint. With all that said, all the little things Queen does with panning on this record are really creative and exciting. This record is a fun one to listen to, and it's thanks to this production that makes these tracks jump around between your ears in a very cool way. This composition is as massive as advertised. There is a large array of instruments from bass to koto, which is a traditional Japanese instrument, which all have a role to play, even if guitars are the most prevalent instrument. The guitars are great, licks are great, solos are amazing. I like it. This album structure is quite interesting too, even if it took a bit to realize it. Side A is your typical classic rock album full of bangers. It's basically a concert set list, and it would make for a fun night out if these were performed live. Side B is the opera section, where the most epic and emotional songs are. And it's where Bohemian Rhapsody is, which is an amazing song in and of itself and deserves its legendary benchmark status in music history. Because, wow. Lyrics are another strong point for this record. The singers who aren't Freddie Mercury are great on their own and on those full-sounding harmonies. But Freddie Mercury is just a legend who shows his unparalleled vocal talent at every opportunity he gets. He's got vocal range, he's got dynamic range, tonal range, timing, and emotional depth, all from his voice. And we mere mortals never deserved a frontman like him. He is so good on this record that it makes me think that those people who say that they were born in the wrong generation might actually be right, because I wish I could have been around to see this guy perform. I mean, a broken clock is right twice a day after all. And all this is not bringing up the lyrics, like the actual lyrics. The night and opera structure I keep mentioning shows up on the lyrics too. The first side consists of fun pop songs for everyone to enjoy, and the second side consists of the emotional tours de force that just blew me away, and blew everyone away. They sound so personal and true to how Queen and Freddie Mercury must have been thinking at the time, how they were feeling at the time. This is an excellent album from start to finish, with flaws, yes, but not a truly bad song. Not one. I can see why people call this Queen's magnum opus, because this is an amazing record and a deserving benchmark in music history. I'm giving this one a decent 9 out of 10. If Queen has taught us anything on A Night at the Opera, it's to keep good company. And I think that I managed to do that with the sponsors of today's episode. The Christened Music Podcast is brought to you in part by Denzel Smatter, host of the Denzel XI Podcast, the number one podcast in the country. Denzel has produced for Toronto rappers such as Houdini, Jay Neat, and Roni, and in his podcast, he talks about his craft in music production as well as what's going on in the music industry. You can listen to the Denzel XI podcast on SoundCloud, as well as on YouTube if you search for Denzel XI. That's Denzel XI. You can also follow Denzel on Twitter and Instagram, where he uploads this podcast as well as his beats. That's the Denzel XI podcast, the number one podcast in the country. That's still very fun to say. The Christened Music Podcast is also brought to you in part by The Hood Teacher and his podcast, The Evil Eyes of Toronto. The Hood Teacher is an upcoming rapper from Toronto who has been around the block. And in his podcast, he talks about gang violence and politics in the streets of the Six. He is a vital voice in the city's time as gang violence increases. Class will be in session on SoundCloud. Follow the producer on Instagram at Mr.9, that's the number 9, INE. Look for The Evil Eyes of Toronto, or they'll be watching you. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this review of Queen's Night at the Opera. Thank you all so much for listening and watching. let me know your thoughts on this record in the comments below. And if you like hearing me talk music and do music, subscribe to the Martelins music channel and hit the bell so you never miss anything I put out. If you want to see more of me and my musical endeavors, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok at Martelins Music. If you want all that in the kitchen sink, you can check out my website at martelinsmusic.wixsite.com/music. And before I leave you, I have music of my own that I am anxious to share with you, and it sounds just a little like...